Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1890, the small mining community of Blackwood Hollow, nestled in the remote hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, became the setting for what local newspapers would later call a most troubling affair. The disappearance of 17 men over the course of 3 years would have remained nothing more than a footnote in the county records were it not for the discovery of a series of ledgers in 1964 during the demolition of an old boarding house on the eastern edge of town. What those ledgers revealed about brothers Samuel and Elijah Thornton would challenge the very fabric of historical record, so much so that county officials reportedly ordered all documentation sealed until 1999. By then, the original files had been reported missing from the county archives. What follows is an account pieced together from newspaper clippings, personal correspondences, and interviews with descendants of Blackwood Hollow, residents who have broken decades of silence. The story of Blackwood Hollow begins, as many Appalachian tales do, with coal. In 1883, surveyors from the Eastern Mining Consortium identified significant coal deposits in the remote valley. Within months, the Blackwood Coal Company had been formed, with capital investments from Philadelphia and New York industrialists eager to exploit the region's natural resources. The first mine shaft was sunk in spring of 1884, and by year's end, a rudimentary settlement had formed around the colliery. Company records indicate that by 1886, some 200 men worked the Blackwood seam, extracting high-quality bituminous coal that was transported via a newly constructed spur line connecting to the Norfolk and Western Railway. Blackwood Hollow followed the typical pattern of company towns throughout Appalachia. The company constructed simple frame houses for married workers, while single men were housed in crowded barracks near the mine entrance. A company store operated on a scrip system, effectively binding workers to the operation through perpetual debt. The town's development was haphazard, growing organically along the narrow valley floor, with structures clinging to the steep hillsides. By 1887, Blackwood Hollow boasted a population of nearly 500 people, though census records from the period are notably incomplete, particularly regarding the transient workforce drawn from recent European immigrants. It was into this rapidly expanding industrial settlement that the Thornton brothers arrived in the spring of 1887. Thornton's letter, dated February 12, 1887, emphasized his experience in providing for the needs of working men and his brother's skills as a cook of considerable talent, particularly in making humble ingredients satisfying to laboring folk. Whitaker's response, dated March 3rd, indicates an enthusiastic reception to the proposal, noting that the company was finding it increasingly difficult to properly house the expanding workforce, and that private enterprise of this nature would be most welcome. The Thornton brothers arrived in Blackwood Hollow in April 1887, purchasing a large 2-story structure that had previously served as storage for the Blackwood Coal Company. Company correspondence preserved in the West Virginia State Archives includes a letter from Samuel Thornton to James Whitaker, superintendent of the Blackwood operation, inquiring about opportunities to establish a private boarding house. The building stood approximately 1 mile from the main mine entrance, positioned advantageously between the colliery and the newly constructed railroad spur. According to property records filed with the county clerk, Samuel Thornton, the elder of the two at 36 years of age, listed his previous occupation as butcher from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His younger brother Elijah, 32, was documented simply as cook. With coal production expanding rapidly throughout McDowell County, the opening of a new boarding house to accommodate the influx of single male workers was received with enthusiasm by the mine operators. A detailed description of the property appears in an insurance document filed with the county in May 1887. The structure measured approximately 60 feet by 40 feet, with the main floor divided into a large dining hall capable of seating 30 men at once, a kitchen, a small office, and private quarters for the proprietors. The upper floor contained 12 rooms of varying sizes, designed to accommodate between 1 and 4 boarders each, with a total capacity of 30 men. Behind the main structure stood a small smokehouse and root cellar built into the hillside, which Samuel Thornton described in the document as essential to our operation, as proper food preservation is the cornerstone of our business model. The property's isolated position, set apart from the main settlement and partially screened by a stand of oak and hickory trees, afforded the establishment a degree of privacy unusual in the cramped confines of a mining town. Within weeks, the Thornton Boardinghouse had filled its 12 rooms with primarily immigrant miners, men from Italy, Poland, and Hungary who spoke limited English and had few connections in the area. Company payroll records indicate that by June 1887, 26 men listed the Thornton establishment as their residence, with their board payments automatically deducted from their wages. The arrangement was typical of mining operations throughout the region. The company facilitated payment directly to the boarding house proprietors, effectively ensuring a steady income for the Thorntons while further binding the workers to the company through financial obligations. By all accounts, the boarding house quickly established a reputation for two things: cleanliness that was unusual for such establishments in mining towns, and meals that were remarkably hearty compared to the usual fare offered to transient workers. The reminiscences of Thomas Hatfield, recorded in 1952 as part of a Works Progress Administration oral history project on mining communities, offer one of the few first-hand accounts of the Thornton operation during its early period. Hatfield, who worked as a timekeeper for the Blackwood Company from 1886 to 1892, recalled, "Those foreign fellows at the Thornton place were the envy of many. While most boarding men got salt pork and beans day in and day out, the Thornton brothers served up proper stews and roasts that you could smell cooking all the way down to the company office when the wind was right. Many a time I considered giving up my room in town to take a place there, though something about the brothers always made me hesitate. There was a queer intensity to them that put me off." A ledger from the Blackwood Company store indicates that the brothers purchased large quantities of vegetables, flour, and sundry goods, but curiously, very little meat compared to other establishments of similar size. When questioned about this discrepancy years later, an elderly clerk recalled that Samuel Thornton had mentioned keeping his own livestock up in the hills, though no record of such a farm exists in county land registers. This explanation was apparently accepted without question, as many residents of mining communities maintained small livestock operations in the surrounding hills to supplement their diets and incomes. What makes this claim particularly notable in retrospect is that no contemporary resident ever reported seeing the brothers transporting animals or meat from the hills to their establishment. The brothers kept to themselves, with Samuel handling the business affairs while Elijah remained almost exclusively in the kitchen. Neither attended the Methodist church that served as the center of community life in Blackwood Hollow, with Samuel explaining to the mine superintendent that Sundays were their busiest day for preparing meals. This social isolation, while perhaps unusual in the close-knit environment of a mining town, did not apparently arouse suspicion at the time. The transient nature of mining populations, particularly in the boom period of the 1880s, meant that many individuals moved through such communities without fully integrating into local social structures. Samuel Thornton, by all accounts, presented himself as a businessman of some education and refinement. Company correspondence shows his communications to be articulate and formal, with penmanship that one clerk described as uncommonly elegant for a man in his position. He maintained regular contact with the mine superintendent, providing monthly reports on occupancy, and occasionally advocating for improvements to the road connecting the boarding house to the main settlement. These reports, preserved in company records, reveal a methodical attention to detail and a careful cultivation of official relationships. In contrast, Elijah Thornton remains a shadowy figure in the historical record, rarely mentioned in company documents, and apparently seldom seen outside the confines of the boarding-house kitchen. The few descriptions that exist portray him as a heavy-set, quiet man who spoke with a slight stammer when forced to engage with strangers. The first troubling incident occurred approximately 8 months after the boarding house opened. An Italian miner named Giuseppe Fiorello failed to report for his shift on a Monday morning in December 1887. His foreman noted his absence, but didn't immediately report it, as it was not uncommon for men to leave without notice for better opportunities in neighboring operations. When questioned, Samuel Thornton produced a receipt showing that Fiorello had paid his board through the previous Friday and had mentioned plans to travel to cousins in Pennsylvania. The matter was considered resolved until 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived addressed to Fiorello from his wife in Naples. The company clerk who translated the correspondence found nothing unusual, simply a wife writing to her husband about family matters, but the very existence of the letter suggested that Fiorello had not planned a departure. When asked about this discrepancy, Samuel Thornton suggested that perhaps the miner had been suddenly called away and hadn't had time to notify his family. In the transient world of mining camps, such explanations were readily accepted. The letter from Fiorello's wife, preserved in company records, offers a poignant counterpoint to the official acceptance of his disappearance. Addressed to "My dear Giuseppe" and dated November 18, 1887, the 4-page letter details family matters in Naples, mentions the sender's hopes of joining her husband in America the following spring, and concludes with a request for him to write more regularly, as your last letter arrived more than 2 months ago. The letter was apparently filed with the company records after attempts to forward it failed, remaining there until the archival examination in the 1960s. No record exists of anyone contacting Fiorello's family in Italy regarding his disappearance, and company payroll documents simply note his employment as terminated December 4, 1887. The winter of 1887 to 1888 passed without further incident at the Thornton boarding house. Company records indicate stable occupancy, with new arrivals quickly filling any vacancies. A notation in the superintendent's log from February 1888 mentions that Mr. S. Thornton reports all rooms occupied with a waiting list of 6 men seeking accommodations, suggesting that the establishment maintained its positive reputation despite the unexplained departure of Fiorello. The same log entry notes approval for the Thorntons to construct an addition to their smokehouse, with the company agreeing to provide lumber from the company sawmill at a reduced rate, indicating a continued good relationship between the brothers and mine management. The second disappearance occurred in March 1888, when a Polish miner named Stanislaw Wojcik failed to appear for 3 consecutive shifts. Like Fiorello, Wojcik was relatively new to the operation, having arrived in Blackwood Hollow only 4 months earlier. Company records show that he had no family in the area and, like many immigrant workers, sent the majority of his wages back to relatives in Europe. When questioned by the shift foreman, Samuel Thornton reportedly stated that Wojcik had left suddenly after receiving a letter, though no such correspondence appears in company records. Unlike the Fiorello case, no subsequent mail arrived for Wojcik, and his disappearance generated less official attention. The mine superintendent's log contains only a brief notation: S. Wojcik, Polish, departed employment without notice. Removed from payroll effective March 18, 1888. What is notable about the Wojcik case in retrospect is a curious entry in the company store ledger dated March 16, 1888, 2 days before his official departure. The entry shows Samuel Thornton purchasing an unusually large quantity of salt, pepper, and herbs, along with several yards of cheesecloth. While such purchases might be unremarkable for a boarding house operation, the timing coincides precisely with Wojcik's disappearance. Similar patterns of purchases would later be identified, corresponding with subsequent disappearances, suggesting a regular process that required specific supplies. At the time, however, no connection was made between these mundane transactions and the missing men. Over the next 2 years, similar disappearances occurred with a frequency that, in retrospect, should have aroused suspicion. Company records show that between January 1888 and October 1890, 16 additional men, all boarders at the Thornton establishment, failed to report for work and were subsequently listed as voluntarily terminated. In each case, Samuel Thornton provided similar explanations. The men had moved on to other opportunities, had returned to their homelands, or had simply left without explanation after paying their debts. What made these disappearances particularly unremarkable to mine officials was their spacing, approximately one every 6 to 8 weeks, and the fact that the missing men were almost exclusively those without family connections in the area. Moreover, the coal industry of the era experienced turnover rates exceeding 100% annually. Men disappeared and new workers arrived with such regularity that individual absences rarely warranted investigation. A pattern emerges when examining the profiles of the men who disappeared. Almost without exception, they were recent immigrants with limited English proficiency and few social connections beyond their immediate workplace. Many were listed in company records as sending remittances to family in Europe, suggesting they had dependents but no local ties. Their positions in the mine were typically the least desirable, working the low seams or in poorly ventilated sections, where more established workers refused to go. In the hierarchy of the mining operation, these men occupied the lowest rungs, making their disappearances less likely to generate concern among management or co-workers. As one mine foreman reportedly remarked when questioned years later, men came and went so regular in those days, particularly the foreigners, that unless they owed money or left equipment behind, nobody much noticed when they moved on. What prevented anyone from connecting these disappearances was the brothers' careful attention to documentation. Each departed miner had his account settled in the company books, with Samuel Thornton often personally delivering final wage assignments to the company office. Examination of these documents in 1964 would reveal that the signatures authorizing these transfers had all been written by the same hand, despite purporting to represent 17 different individuals. But in 1890, with limited record-keeping practices and overworked company clerks, such details went unnoticed. Indeed, the brothers' establishment continued to thrive, with Samuel even approaching the mine superintendent in September 1890 about expanding their operation to accommodate 4 additional rooms. Throughout this period, the Thornton brothers maintained their isolation from the broader community, though in ways that apparently did not arouse suspicion. Samuel was described by those who dealt with him as unfailingly polite but reserved, conducting necessary business efficiently, but rarely engaging in the social discourse that characterized life in the small community. Elijah remained an even more elusive figure, with many in the town reporting they had never seen him at all. The brothers' absence from church services, community gatherings, and even the saloons where most men socialized might have seemed peculiar in another context, but the demanding nature of running a boarding house provided a ready explanation for their reclusiveness. The Thornton establishment itself developed a curious duality in its reputation. On one hand, it was known for exceptional cleanliness and meals of unusual quality. On the other, some miners reported a reluctance to take accommodation there despite these advantages. Thomas Hatfield's oral history again provides insight. There was something unwelcoming about the place, though you couldn't put your finger on just what. The rooms were clean and the food better than what most boarding men got, but fellows who stayed there didn't seem to make friends in town. They kept to themselves, almost like the brothers had them under some spell. Some of the local men started calling it the Quiet House, on account of how little talk or laughter you ever heard coming from it, even with 20 or more men living there. Despite these vague misgivings, the boarding house remained fully occupied throughout its operation. Company records indicate that demand for rooms consistently exceeded availability, with Samuel Thornton maintaining a waiting list of potential boarders. The premium rates charged, approximately 15% higher than other boarding options in the area, did not deter applicants, suggesting that the quality of accommodations and meals outweighed both the cost and any nebulous discomfort associated with the establishment. For the Blackwood Coal Company, the arrangement was ideal, a private enterprise addressing housing needs without requiring company investment, while still maintaining indirect control through the payroll deduction system. By the summer of 1890, the Thornton brothers had operated their boarding house for over 3 years without arousing official suspicion. The disappearance of 17 men during this period had generated no collective concern, each case treated as an isolated incident, explained by the transient nature of the mining workforce. The brothers had established themselves as reliable, if somewhat peculiar, members of the business community, with Samuel's regular reports to mine management maintaining a veneer of transparency. Their establishment had expanded slightly, with the addition of a larger smokehouse and storage cellar built into the hillside behind the main structure, improvements that Samuel explained as necessary to maintain our standards of quality as demand increases. Had it not been for an unseasonably heavy rainfall in late October 1890, the true nature of the Thornton brothers' operation might never have come to light. The downpour, which lasted 3 days, caused significant erosion along the hillside behind the boarding house, where the brothers maintained a small smokehouse and storage cellar. According to an account published in the McDowell County Register on November 3, 1890, a portion of the hillside collapsed, exposing what was described only as evidence of most troubling activities. The newspaper account, notably vague in its details, indicated that the mine superintendent had summoned the county sheriff, who subsequently placed both brothers under arrest. The article concluded by noting that further reporting on the matter had been suspended at the request of county officials pending a complete investigation. Weather records from the period confirmed the exceptional nature of the rainfall, with a local station recording over 9 inches of precipitation between October 26 and 29, 1890. This deluge, coming after an unusually dry summer, would have saturated the clay-heavy soil of the hillside, potentially compromising the structural integrity of any excavations. What exactly was exposed by the collapse remains subject to interpretation, as the newspaper account deliberately avoids specifics. However, a private letter from James Whitaker, the mine superintendent, to the company's main office in Philadelphia, dated November 1, 1890, provides some indication. The letter, discovered among company papers in the state archives, states only that a most disturbing discovery has been made regarding the Thornton operation, and that several items of a nature too grim to detail in correspondence have been recovered from a previously unknown cellar room. Whitaker's letter concludes by assuring the company directors that the matter is being handled with the utmost discretion to avoid unnecessary alarm among the workforce and potential damage to the company's standing. No follow-up story ever appeared in the Register or any other local publication. Court records from November and December 1890 show that the brothers were held in custody, but no formal charges were ever filed. A single entry in the sheriff's daily log, dated December 17, 1890, notes, "Thornton matter resolved. Subjects remanded to State Hospital at Weston by judicial order. Site at Blackwood, sealed by County Health Authority." The reference to Weston suggests the brothers were committed to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, later renamed Weston State Hospital, though no admission records for either Samuel or Elijah Thornton appear in the facility's archived documents. The absence of formal charges or trial proceedings is particularly notable given the apparent severity of whatever was discovered. Legal scholars who have examined the case suggest that this unusual handling might reflect several possibilities: concerns about the ability to secure convictions given the circumstantial nature of evidence, a desire to avoid public scandal that might damage the mining operation's ability to attract workers, or perhaps most disturbing, a recognition that the full details of the brothers' activities were simply too horrific for public airing in the cultural context of the time. The commitment to a mental institution rather than prosecution represented a convenient resolution, removing the brothers from society while avoiding the public exposure that a trial would necessitate. More curious still is what happened to the boarding house itself. According to property tax records, ownership of the structure reverted to the Blackwood Coal Company in January 1891. However, rather than continuing its operation or selling it to new proprietors, the company designated the building as unsuitable for habitation and converted it to storage use only. A company memo preserved in the archives of the now-defunct coal operation instructed employees that the former boarding house was to be used exclusively for non-perishable equipment, and that the rear portion of the property was to remain sealed and undisturbed. The memo, signed by the mine superintendent, concluded with an unusual directive: no discussion of previous occupants or activities is permitted among company employees. The company's handling of the property suggests a deliberate attempt to literally bury whatever had occurred there. Engineering reports from February 1891 indicate that the hillside behind the structure was reinforced with timber supports and then covered with a substantial earthwork, effectively sealing the area where the collapse had occurred. The smokehouse and cellar entrance were demolished, with the debris apparently used as fill before the earthwork was put in place. These measures, unusual for a simple slope stabilization project, suggest a concerted effort to permanently conceal something located in that area. The main structure of the boarding house remained standing, but was surrounded by a sturdy fence with posted warnings about structural instability, despite there being no record of any damage to the building itself. For the residents of Blackwood Hollow, this official silence fostered an atmosphere of unspoken dread. Oral histories collected from descendants of miners who lived in the community during this period suggest that while no one publicly discussed what had been discovered behind the Thornton boarding house, private whispers maintained the collective memory. Mary Kovalchuk, whose grandfather worked in the Blackwood mine from 1889 to 1902, recalled in a 1958 interview with a folklore student from West Virginia University. Grandfather would never eat meat stew after that time. He would never say why, but grandmother told me once it had to do with the bad house where men went missing. The whole town knew something terrible happened there, but it wasn't spoken of. Similar accounts appear in several other oral histories, though always with the same reluctance to specify details. This collective silence extended beyond the immediate community. County records from the period show an unusual gap in documentation regarding Blackwood Hollow, with routine reports and correspondence suddenly becoming minimal and formalistic after November 1890. The annual health inspector's reports, which had previously included detailed observations about conditions in various settlements throughout the county, contain only the briefest mention of Blackwood in 1891 and 1892, noting simply that conditions meet minimum standards without the customary elaboration. Similarly, the county sheriff's office, which had maintained regular correspondence with the mine superintendent regarding various matters of public order, abruptly reduced communication to formal acknowledgments of reports received. This pattern suggests a broader institutional decision to minimize official attention to the community in the aftermath of whatever had been discovered. Perhaps most telling is the reaction of the immigrant community that had formed the primary clientele of the Thornton boarding house. Company records indicate that in the 3 months following the brothers' arrest, more than 40 miners, predominantly those of Eastern European origin, departed Blackwood Hollow despite the continuing availability of work. This exodus, representing nearly 20% of the workforce, occurred during winter months, when mining jobs were typically most secure, suggesting that information about the nature of the Thornton operation had circulated among these workers despite the official silence. A company report from February 1891 notes with concern that the foreign element has become increasingly difficult to retain, necessitating increased recruitment efforts in neighboring operations, though it makes no connection to recent events. The nature of what exactly was discovered at the Boardinghouse in October 1890 remained obscured for decades, with official records providing only the vaguest outlines. The newspaper account mentioned troubling activities, while the sheriff's log referred only to the Thornton matter. Company correspondents carefully avoided specifics, referring obliquely to the regrettable incident or the matter behind the Boardinghouse. This deliberate vagueness, maintained consistently across multiple sources, suggests a coordinated effort to minimize documentation of whatever had been found. Such coordination would have required the involvement of local government officials, company management, and likely county medical authorities, indicating the seriousness with which the matter was viewed. Some indication of what might have been discovered comes from an unexpected source, the personal diary of Dr. William Chambers, the county health officer from 1888 to 1896. Chambers, who would have been involved in any official response to the discovery, maintained a private journal that remained in his family's possession until being donated to the State Historical Society in 1978. An entry dated November 2, 1890, contains a cryptic but suggestive passage. Called to B.H. regarding the tea matter. What we found exceeds the bounds of civilized contemplation. Identified remains of at least 3 individuals in various states of preparation. The implements suggest a methodical approach to an unthinkable process. Sheriff C. concurs that full disclosure would cause undue public distress, recommended sanitization, and commitment rather than criminal process. This brief entry, with its references to remains, preparation, and implements, provides the first documentary suggestion of what the hillside collapse might have revealed. The most compelling evidence of what actually occurred at the Thornton Boardinghouse emerged during its demolition in 1964. By then, the Blackwood mine had been closed for over a decade, and the abandoned buildings of the once thriving community were being cleared for a never-completed development project. According to the site foreman's report, filed with the County Development Commission, workers discovered a sealed room in the cellar of the Boardinghouse that contained several ledgers, along with tools and implements that the report describes only as consistent with butchering operations. The ledgers, which eventually made their way to a county archivist, contained what appeared to be detailed records of the Boardinghouse operation from 1887 to 1890. What made these ledgers remarkable was not their accounting of daily operations, but rather the additional notations that accompanied entries for certain boarders. Next to names that correspond with the 17 men who disappeared were annotations regarding weight, quality, and yield, followed by calculations of meals provided. Additionally, several pages contained what appeared to be recipes, with unusual ingredient listings and preparation notes. The archivist who initially examined these materials reportedly contacted the state police, which led to a brief investigation in early 1965. However, according to internal memos obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2002, the investigation was terminated after intervention from unspecified county officials who determined that no actionable evidence exists regarding matters occurred beyond statutory limitations. The ledgers themselves provide the most direct evidence of the brothers' activities, though their clinical detachment makes them all the more disturbing. Written in Samuel Thornton's distinctive hand, they document the Boardinghouse operation with meticulous attention to detail, recording daily expenses, occupancy rates, and meal planning. Interspersed with these mundane business records, however, are entries that take on a horrific significance when considered alongside the disappearances. One such entry, dated March 19, 1888, the day after Stanislaw Wojcik was officially terminated from employment, reads, SDW. Processing complete. Initial yield approx. 58 kilos of usable material. Quality exceptional due to youth and condition. E. Particularly pleased with potential for extended usage in varied preparations. Conservative estimate of 22-25 meals at current occupancy. Similar entries appear following the dates of other known disappearances, each with calculations of yield and projected meal counts. More disturbing still are the recipe pages, which detail preparation methods for various dishes served at the boarding house. While many are conventional recipes for bread, porridge, and vegetables, others contain references to special meat or reserved protein with specific instructions for preparation to mask distinctive characteristics. One entry, titled simply Miner's Stew, includes the notation, always combine with strong flavors, garlic, paprika, bay leaf. Important, ensure complete cooking to avoid recognition of source. Foreign miners prefer more heavily spiced preparations, making detection unlikely. These clinical instructions, written with the same methodical attention that characterize the brothers' business operations, suggest a calculated approach to serving human flesh to unsuspecting boarders. The ledgers and associated materials were supposedly transferred to the State Historical Archives in Charleston with instructions that they remain sealed until 1999. When researchers attempted to access these materials after that date, they were informed that the files had been misplaced during a reorganization of the archives in the late 1970s. Whether this represents an actual loss or a deliberate suppression remains subject to debate among historians interested in the case. What can be verified is that in 1966, all remaining structures in Blackwood Hollow were razed, the mine entrances were sealed, and the area was designated as part of a wildlife management area, effectively removing it from public access. The lives of the Thornton brothers after their apparent commitment to the asylum at Weston remain equally obscured. No death certificates exist for either man in West Virginia records. However, a patient register from the Western Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane near Pittsburgh contains an entry from March 1893 documenting the admission of a Samuel T. with the notation, transfer from West Virginia facility. The entry notes his occupation as meat merchant and diagnosis as moral insanity with homicidal tendencies. No further records of his treatment or eventual fate have been located. As for Elijah Thornton, a single reference appears in the 1910 census for Washington County, Pennsylvania, listing an Eli Thornton, age 52, residing as a farmhand with the Whitaker family. His place of birth is listed as West Virginia, though earlier records indicated both brothers had been born in Pennsylvania. Whether this represents the same individual cannot be conclusively determined. The absence of clear records regarding the brothers' fate reflects the broader pattern of institutional silence that surrounded the entire affair. From the immediate aftermath, with its lack of formal charges and newspaper coverage, to the sealing of records and eventual loss of key documents, there appears to have been a sustained effort to minimize official documentation of what occurred in Blackwood Hollow. This effort extended across decades and involved multiple institutions, suggesting a recognition that the events transcended ordinary crime and entered a realm that challenged fundamental social taboos. What emerges from this fragmented historical record is the outline of events that officials at multiple levels apparently deemed too disturbing to maintain in public records. The reluctance of local residents to discuss the matter, even decades later, suggests a collective trauma that deeply affected the community. Dr. Margaret Shelton, a historian specializing in Appalachian industrial communities, noted in a 1968 paper that Blackwood Hollow represented a curious case of communal silence that extended beyond typical instances of tragedy or disaster. In most mining communities, she wrote, disasters become part of local identity and shared narrative. In Blackwood, however, we see an active suppression of memory that suggests something beyond the pale of even the harsh realities these communities regularly faced. The most troubling aspect of the Thornton case is not simply what appears to have been a series of murders, but rather the implication of what happened to the victims afterward. The ledger entries, with their clinical notations of yield and meals provided, point to a conclusion so disturbing that contemporary newspapers declined to state it explicitly, and officials apparently determined that the public record should be purged of the details. In the absence of the missing documentation, we are left with only the suggestion contained in the title that has persisted in local oral tradition: the brothers who fed the boarding house. This phrase, passed down through generations of McDowell County residents, contains the awful truth that seems to have been deemed too horrific for historical record. The Thornton brothers apparently did not merely kill their boarders, they processed them as food that was then served to their remaining tenants. The remarkably hearty meals that distinguished their establishment, the minimal purchases of meat from the company store, the specialized tools found in the cellar, and the detailed records of yield all point to a practice of cannibalism that would have been almost unthinkable in late 19th century America. The brothers operated what was, in essence, a closed system. Isolated immigrant workers with few connections disappeared one by one, while their remains, processed as food, were unwittingly consumed by the next wave of boarders. The psychological impact of this revelation on the community, once the nature of the brothers' operation became known, can only be imagined. For workers who had boarded at the establishment, the realization of what they had unknowingly consumed would have represented a violation of the most fundamental taboos. The subsequent exodus of immigrant workers makes perfect sense in this context. Not simply a reaction to murder, but to an act that transcended ordinary criminality and violated basic human norms. Similarly, the decision by officials to suppress details rather than prosecute reflects a recognition that such acts existed beyond the framework of conventional justice, threatening the social order itself if publicly acknowledged. What remains unexplained is how the brothers avoided detection for nearly 3 years. The careful spacing of disappearances suggests a calculated approach to their activities, while the forged documentation demonstrates a methodical attention to maintaining appearances. Yet questions persist about how the processing of human remains could occur without arousing suspicion, particularly in a small community where residents lived in close proximity. Some historians have suggested that the remote location of the boarding house, positioned away from the main settlement, and the unusual autonomy granted to the brothers by the mining company, which was primarily concerned with maintaining a stable workforce, created conditions where such activities could remain undetected. The brothers' backgrounds provide little insight into their motivations. The limited information available indicates that before arriving in Blackwood Hollow, Samuel had indeed worked as a butcher in Pittsburgh, while Elijah had been employed in various kitchens. No criminal records have been located for either man prior to the events in West Virginia, though this does not preclude the possibility of similar activities that went undiscovered. The commitment of both brothers to mental institutions rather than criminal prosecution suggests that authorities viewed their actions as stemming from psychiatric disturbance rather than ordinary criminal intent, though the standards for such determinations in the late 19th century were far from the modern understanding of mental illness. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Thornton case is the institutional response, the apparent decision at multiple levels of authority to essentially erase the event from historical record. From the abrupt cessation of newspaper coverage to the sealing of the site, from the commitment of the brothers to an asylum rather than prosecution in criminal court, to the eventual loss of the archival materials, there appears to have been a coordinated effort to suppress all documentation of what occurred in Blackwood Hollow. This suggests a recognition that the events transcended ordinary crime and entered a realm of horror that threatened fundamental social norms. The impact on the community extended beyond the immediate aftermath. Mining company records show that Blackwood Hollow experienced difficulty attracting workers throughout 1891 and 1892, despite the general economic depression that typically made mining jobs more desirable. Production declined steadily, with company reports noting increased costs for recruitment and higher than normal turnover rates. By 1893, the workforce had stabilized somewhat, but company correspondence indicates continuing concerns about the persistent negative associations that affected recruitment efforts. The boarding house building itself remained unused except for storage, with a company memo from 1894 rejecting a proposal to renovate it for housing, noting simply that the structure remains unsuitable for habitation due to historical considerations that render it permanently undesirable. In the decades following the Thornton case, Blackwood Hollow gradually disappeared from maps and public memory. The mine closed in 1925 after declining production, and the last residents departed by the early 1940s. Today, the site where the boarding house once stood is covered by secondary forest growth, with only the faint outline of foundations visible to those who know where to look. No historical marker commemorates what occurred there, and local tourism materials make no mention of Blackwood Hollow, beyond noting it as one of many ghost towns of the coal era. The deliberate forgetting seems to have been largely successful, yet the story persists, transmitted through generations in fragmentary form, resistant to official erasure. In 1957, folklorist Henry Glassy documented a cautionary tale told to children in several McDowell County communities about the bad brothers who ate miners, though most parents he interviewed claimed ignorance of its historical basis. A ballad titled The Blackwood Hollow Boarding House was recorded by musicologist Alan Lomax in 1959 from an elderly miner who refused to provide his name and insisted that Lomax not publish the lyrics. These cultural echoes suggest that despite institutional efforts to erase the Thornton case, the collective memory retained at least the outline of events too horrific to forget completely. The transmission of the story through folklore rather than official history reflects a common pattern in communities that have experienced events beyond the parameters of normal understanding. When institutional records fail, whether through deliberate suppression or simple neglect, oral tradition often preserves at least the essence of what occurred. The very persistence of the Thornton story, despite its absence from written history, testifies to its impact on the collective consciousness of the region. It became, in effect, the kind of tale that needed to be remembered even when official channels deemed it better forgotten. What makes the Thornton case particularly notable from a historical perspective is not simply its macabre nature, but rather the extensive institutional effort to remove it from the record. While many horrific crimes occurred in isolated mining communities during this period, few generated the kind of coordinated response evident in Blackwood Hollow. The involvement of company officials, local government, medical authorities, and eventually state archivists in the suppression of information suggests a recognition that what occurred there represented something beyond ordinary criminal activity, a fundamental transgression that challenged the social order itself. The decision to commit rather than prosecute, to bury rather than document, to forget rather than memorialize, reveals much about the limits of what even a society familiar with violence and hardship was willing to incorporate into its official narrative. In recent years, increased scholarly interest in hidden histories has led some researchers to re-examine the fragmentary evidence of the Thornton case, placing it within broader contexts of industrial exploitation, immigrant vulnerability, and institutional power in Appalachian communities. The disappearance of immigrant workers, easily explained away and quickly forgotten, reflects the disposability of such individuals within the economic system of the time. The company's apparent prioritization of operational stability over thorough investigation speaks to the subordination of human concerns to industrial imperatives. The collective silence that followed, whether imposed from above or arising from communal trauma, illustrates how narratives deemed too disturbing can be excluded from the historical record through both formal and informal mechanisms. As we conclude this account, we should perhaps consider the implications of uncovering histories that were deliberately buried. The case of the Thornton brothers represents more than simply a macabre historical curiosity. It offers insight into how communities and institutions respond to events that defy conventional understanding of human behavior. The decision to suppress rather than document, to commit rather than prosecute, to forget rather than memorialize, tells us something about the limits of what society is willing to incorporate into its official narrative. Some violations, it seems, are deemed too fundamental to acknowledge. In the hollows of West Virginia, where the remains of abandoned mining communities slowly return to nature, there are many forgotten stories of labor struggles, of industrial accidents, of lives lived in harsh conditions. But the story of Blackwood Hollow and the Thornton Boardinghouse represents a different kind of forgetting, deliberate, coordinated, and sustained across generations. As one elderly resident told a researcher in 1962, some things happened in these hills that God himself would rather not remember. In the silence that has enveloped Blackwood Hollow for over a century, perhaps we can discern the boundaries of what a community can bear to know about itself. For those traveling through McDowell County today, there is nothing to indicate the location of Blackwood Hollow or the horrors that occurred there in the closing years of the 19th century. The forest has reclaimed the land, covering the foundations of the buildings and healing the scars of industry. Yet somewhere beneath the leaf litter and new growth lie the remnants of a boarding house, where 17 men disappeared into a fate so terrible that history itself turned away. Their names, mostly forgotten, live on only in fragmented company records and in the fading oral traditions of a region that has learned, perhaps necessarily, to guard its darkest secrets. In the rustling of leaves and the silence of abandoned places, their story remains, unspoken, unwritten, but never completely erased. What the Thornton case ultimately teaches us is that the boundaries of historical memory are not defined solely by what happened, but by what a society can bear to remember. Some events, it seems, are deemed too disturbing to incorporate into our collective narrative, too threatening to our understanding of ourselves as civilized beings. Yet these very events, in their extremity, may reveal important truths about human nature and the fragility of social norms. As we recover such buried histories, we must grapple not only with the horrors they contain, but with the question of why they were buried in the first place, and what their exclusion tells us about the limits of our historical consciousness. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to the victims of the Thornton brothers is not a historical marker or a museum exhibit, but rather the very persistence of their story against all institutional efforts to erase it. In continuing to speak of what happened in Blackwood Hollow, we affirm that even those deemed disposable in their time, immigrant workers with few connections, whose disappearances generated little official concern, deserve to be remembered. Their story, however disturbing, forms part of the complex tapestry of our collective past, reminding us that history includes not only what we choose to celebrate, but also what we have tried to forget.